Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Shirish Kapoor. I'm the President and Principal of King's College London, and it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's fantastic event to mark a decade since a truly landmark event in a moment happened. Now, it's just the history of progress of humankind that it's not straight. It's 2 steps forward, 1 to the side, then a little bit of a back turn, and then 1.5 steps forward. But along that journey, it is punctuated by moments which actually mark a huge leap. And I think we are here today to celebrate something that happened first. On the 9th of October 2012, when Julia Gillard, the then Prime Minister of Australia and now the chair of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership here at King's, delivered an impassioned speech which has since become iconic. A speech which was voted by the Guardian readers as the most unforgettable moment in Australian television history. And I had the privilege, actually I was here when the speech happened in 2012, but then from 2016 to 2021, I had the privilege of being in Australia, and I got a real feel for the meaning this speech has come to have in Australia. So I am delighted that the misogyny speech, as people talk about it, not only had an impact in Australia, but has now had an impact all around the world. It reverberated around the world and has had even more recent resurgence on social media, which has brought its message of calling out sexism and misogyny to a new audience. And it keeps rolling on to the next generation. So 10 years on, this speech continues to inspire us and challenges us to call out sexism and misogyny in every field. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Julia's reflections on the legacy of the speech and what she thinks comes next in this journey, in this endless journey towards equity and equality. I'm equally delighted to welcome Professor Mary Beard, and I was wonderful to learn from Mary that she actually started her academic career here at King's. So it's wonderful to welcome you back then. You are a national treasure and arguably the world's most famous classicist, whose own fight against misogyny have made you a feminist icon. Now, Professor Beard has traced the origins of misogyny in her book, Women and Power, a Manifesto, in which she states, written into Western literature and it starts at the very, very beginning of it. And that's her lesson about misogyny for us. She's also contributed a chapter to Not Now, Not Ever, and that's the book, a book edited by Julia Gillard that looks at the impact of her speech from an array of different perspectives. And of course, copies of this book will be available to buy in the arcade this evening. And after you've heard from both Julia and Mary, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please keep your questions ready. But first, we're going to kick off this evening with a short video to remind us of that speech in 2012 and the profound impact it has had, hearing in particular from some of those who witnessed the moment firsthand. So thank you again for coming. You're in for a treat. There we are.
I call the Prime Minister.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
It was just an electric feeling. I felt like I was there while history was being made. I knew that the speech is one that would survive the test of time.
If he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives, he needs a mirror.
When I first heard it, I really felt, thank God she's finally said something, because there had been a drumbeat. There had been this building of pressure for so long, and no one was calling it out.
What if men are by physiology or temperament more adapted to exercise authority or to issue command?
I had just got elected myself as an independent to local government, and it was the first time ever. And I remember watching the news and seeing Julia in that blue jacket and pointing across the floor to the opposition leader, and I just thought, wow, I thought it was amazing.
I was in year 11, just came out of my physics class, and I remember a friend who had her phone on her during school hours, which she wasn't allowed to, came up to me and said, there's this incredible misogyny speech that's gone viral.
As they do the ironing. Thank you for that painting of women's roles in modern Australia.
This speech was part of a very political issue on a very political day.
I was offended too by the sexism, by the misogyny of the Leader of the Opposition catcalling across this table at me as I sit here as Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister wants to, politically speaking, make an honest woman of herself, something that would never have been said to any man sitting in this chair. I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition went outside in the front of Parliament and stood next to a sign that said, "Ditch the witch." I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition stood next to a sign that described me as a man's bitch. I was offended by those things. Misogyny, sexism, every day from this Leader of the Opposition. Every day, in every way.
The government had been under attack. Tony Abbott was a very aggressive leader of the opposition and he'd been very strongly attacking the Prime Minister and the government. And the feel in the chamber was from a government that was, a bit on the back foot. Julia got up, delivered this speech, and it completely changed the way the Parliament felt. It really felt like her justifiable anger at the shocking misogyny she had experienced.
The focus of the day politically was on the Speaker at that point, Peter Slipper. Some text messages had emerged that were, crude to say the least. Tony Abbott, who was very expert in that Parliament at queuing up a sense of crisis or a sense of the government being unable to govern, being on a razor's edge, had built up this sort of sense of drama throughout the day.
Every day the Prime Minister stands in this Parliament to defend this Speaker will be another day of shame for this Parliament, another day of shame for a government which should already have died of shame.
Their approach from our perspective as the opposition was they were hanging on to this tainted speakership, and that in itself was an example of bad language, sexist language, poor behaviour, and so on. So while the speech itself has been lifted above and beyond the circumstances in which it was delivered, I still recall those circumstances in very great detail.
There was a particular context of which Julia Gillard's speech was given, but I'd argue there was more than one. There had been this drumbeat of sexist abuse and a deliberate trying to tear down of our first female Prime Minister.
We are entitled to a better standard than this.
She's using the charge of sexism and misogyny as a weapon against her critics.
If the Prime Minister and her outraged female ministers can't take it, well, they can just get out of the kitchen.
It's time that everyone in the Parliament moved on from this gender card.
I think one of the reasons that so many journalists missed it at the time is because they sort of bought that notion. Like the Liberals were saying, stop playing the gender card. They called those of us who were defending Julia and calling out the sexism, they were calling us the handbag hit squad.
What was happening on that day was not unimportant to the fate of the government. It was not unimportant, but the commentary was refracted through that lens. Julia Gillard's on the ropes. Julia Gillard's in the fight of her life. So as a group, I think we to a man and a woman, we miss the cultural significance of the moment.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever.
I think it continues to resonate because every woman I know has had that feeling of like, I've had a gutful, enough now already. I think that's why it will always resonate, and I think that's why it resonated internationally as well. I think women everywhere have had that feeling. I'm so pleased that so many younger people are discovering or rediscovering the speech. I'm so impressed by this generation of young feminists.
I felt it was good, but I also felt concerned because there was only her doing it, and I don't know if it will. It's for a woman like myself. It was quite, can I do that? Can I ever do what she just did?
With the misogyny speech, I wouldn't say that things changed overnight, but it was planting the seed. And I think over the years we saw female empowerment on the rise. And I remember going to my first ever Young Labour meeting, and it was just a massive room filled with mostly men.
If it has given young women, in fact any woman, courage and heart to fight back where they see the circumstances of their own life or their own workplace not ideal, then I think that's a good thing. As indeed I've always said about Julia Gillard as Prime Minister. I was proud of her as the first female Prime Minister.
If there was sustained criticism of that nature that was not related to reasonable policy discussion or political judgment, was just basically sexism or misogyny, I think there would be more consequences now.
Our next female Prime Minister will be treated differently. There will still be the challenges because this is very much still a bloke's world. It's a boys' club. We are slowly breaking that down and we're exposing it, and the sunshine helps to deal with all of this. It's the best disinfectant. All of us as women in this place have to learn how to manoeuvre our way through. But I think Julia Gillard has given a huge service, and we owe her all a huge debt, and the next female Prime Minister owes her a huge debt from whatever side of politics, because the first time is always going to be the toughest.
Well, it's great to be here and to see everybody here and to feel like we're part of the handbag hit squad. I think that I have no admiration for Mrs. Thatcher except in one respect. She did manage to weaponise the handbag. And for that, I shall always be grateful, right? We've seen a bit of this speech. And its immediate context was quite a complicated bit of not very edifying Australian politics. But when I look at it, I don't actually think about the immediate context. I mean, it looks to me like this was a moment when Julia Gillard got uncorked, if you know what I mean. It all came out. It was like a champagne bottle exploding. And you say in this book, very interestingly, that you felt up to that point that you'd a bit mishandled issues of sexism and gender and misogyny in the early part of being Prime Minister. I wonder if you can tell us, how you fit that speech into that experience that you had.
Sure, I'm very happy to talk about that. But Mary, firstly, I want to say thank you very much for coming along to be part of this conversation. I am moderately concerned that being interviewed by a classicist is in some way reflecting on how I'm dating and ageing. I'm going to have to think about that for the next few days, but it's absolutely terrific to have you here.
Cool.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Classics, very cool. I'm also going to have to teach you about how to uncork a bottle of champagne without wasting any of it. But yes, I did mishandle, with the benefit of hindsight, the issues around gender and sexism in my Prime Ministership. And what I underestimated was just how deep and long-lasting the gendered critiques and the misogyny surrounding it would be. I actually thought when I first became Prime Minister that there would be a huge reaction to me being the first woman, and a lot of that would be a very positive reaction, a sort of go-girl thing from women and girls, and from many men, very delighted to see the first woman as Prime Minister. I also thought there would be a negative reaction, people who were discomforted by the prospect of that much change. But I thought just doing the job, and I think women right around the world have probably made this error themselves from time to time. I thought by just doing the job, hopefully just being seen to be good at it, that all of that would fall away and I'd be judged on my work performance. And in the hothouse of Australian politics, that is never going to bring you accolades and kind words, because we play our politics pretty rough, but it would be business as normal. What actually happened was the longer we governed, the more controversial things became, the worse the gendered critiques became. And as the video made very, very clear, by that stage, trying to call out sexism was going to always get the retort that you're only doing this to distract from the government's political problems. You're only doing this because the government's in difficulties. So you never get to run the control test in politics, but I do wonder whether potentially things might have been different if in the early days of my Prime Ministership, when some gendered things happen, often much more benign than what was happening at the end, but even, you know, just the ridiculous focus on appearance and things like that, if I'd started the national conversation then, we might have been able to defang it a bit before it got as bad as you saw on the video.
Because when you do speak, I mean, I've seen in the book your completely illegible notes for the speech,
Yes,
you know, which maybe you could read them, but I couldn't read them. I could see mirror, you know, written out. I thought, oh, right, that was planned. But, I mean, you look as if it is just all coming. You know, you've been waiting, in some ways, you've been waiting for this moment to tell these buggers. And that's what you go and do. And even, I mean, it's quite interesting. When you read it, you think, seeing it again was very interesting. I look at the word offended, and I think, did she have to say she was offended? When I look at it on the video, that was spot on. You know, I am offended by you. And, you know, had you sort of practiced that in your head for, you know, before, or did it just come? What's your recollection of that?
No practicing in my head or anywhere else. I do think what gives the speech its power and immediacy is clearly, over time, my frustration about all of this was building. And because I'd not called it out early, because it was more difficult to call it out, because it would have looked odd having not said anything, not said anything, not said anything, to suddenly say something, people would say, well, why is she doing that now? There had really been no opportunity to talk it through. And I obviously used to think about it, but in some ways I couldn't spend a whole lot of energy and time thinking about the gendered treatment of my Prime Ministership, because being Prime Minister is kind of a relentless job. You've got a fair bit to do. And you could see the abuse, and often it was in the periphery of my vision. It wasn't directly in front of me. But you just needed to get on and get on and get on, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. So I think there had been this sense of frustration welling up. And then the circumstances of that day where the opposition was going to try and play an attack about sexism against me, you know, the galling nature of that.
I'd have hit them, you know.
Yeah, given everything that had been happening, I think triggered this sort of, you know, cooling anger into something more fluid and really, really there. And when Tony Abbott gave me the opportunity to give a speech, I didn't miss it.
Well, what is odd, though, is that some of the immediate reaction from the press gallery was not in your favour. We think, you know, I've always thought of this speech as being, you know, eye-opener. Everybody must have instantly applauded, apart from Abbott. But the press were not initially very nice, were they?
No, not at all. In the video, the woman with the red hair and the blue jacket, Catherine Murphy, she is a very noted Australian journalist, and she has actually written a chapter for the book. And it's a very, very thoughtful dissection about why the Australian media missed it. And she, in some ways, says, well, you know, you would expect the Australian media to look at the political circumstances of that day and to interpret it through the lens of Australian politics, which was about minority government being under attack, what was going to happen with the Speaker. You know, you could sort of see why that was their frame of reference. But she goes deeper than that and talks about how she and a number of other women were coming into political reporting at a time of change. She talks about being one of the ones that first took up social media, which meant that she was tweeting and blogging about what was happening in politics from early in the morning till 10:30 at night, as the media tried to adapt itself to these new and more immediate rhythms of reporting. But she says she and other women had accepted that their standpoint when they were doing all of that was supposed to be the neutral observer. That's what they'd been taught a journalist was. And to the extent that they ever reacted to things as a woman, seeing it as a woman and thinking about how a woman might feel if these things were said about her, they suppressed that because that was kind of not the neutral observer standpoint, so they thought it was wrong. And how one of the things that's happened since the misogyny speech is women journalists are now much more knowing about all of this and much more prepared to write visibly, demonstrably, from the standpoint of being a woman about what they're seeing.
So it initially, in the first hours, days, gets sort of written off as a rant?
Yeah, it got written, you know, the kindest would have said it was a powerful speech in difficult circumstances when the government was coming off the back foot. The more hard-hitting would have said rant, great net negative, will cause Australian men to become angry and to vote against her. That terminology about the gender card, which was used in the video, you know, playing the gender card, starting a gender war, all of that was littered through the newspaper reporting. And what really came and sort of fed into the Canberra Press Gallery wasn't any spontaneous reassessment about whether they'd got that right. It was that the speech was travelling overseas and overseas media were writing it up incredibly differently. And then because of social media, that was penetrating into the Australian media news cycle. And then the journos were like, hang on, in New York and London and places like that, they're seeing something different here, so we've got to recalibrate.
Yeah. And their first knee-jerk reaction, and it still is, I think, is when woman does powerful speech to say she's having a rant, she's shrieking. I mean, only the other day I saw a headline in the newspaper about Jane Garvey, who'd said something perfectly reasonable on radio about equal pay. And the headline was Jane Garvey rants about equal pay.
Right.
You think, rants about equal pay? You know, this is a major contribution. It's not a rant, but part of the misogyny that you're contesting is the way that your interventions are described.
Absolutely. And when I was in Australia recently and we were, commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the speech the way we're doing now, and we were using it as a platform to foster new conversations about misogyny, I appeared on stage in Melbourne and Sydney and with an incredible array of young women. But one of the young women, Georgie, spoke about being impossibly young when the speech was given. She was 12 or something like that. And she said what really impacted her was it was the first time that she'd seen a woman sitting comfortably in her anger, because she had always been taught, there's no There's no space for the angry girl. If you're feeling angry, you know, choke it down. You know, whatever's happened, suck it up, because it's your job to make the world a more pleasant place for others, not to be sitting there in your anger or demonstrating anger. And so she said that was the impact it had on her. And I must admit, I'm now reflecting back on it through her eyes, because I've never heard it described like that before. But I do think there's the sexist critique about how we see anger in men and women. And so no one likes anybody who is unfairly angry or really het up angry. But I think in politics, there's plenty of space given to the powerful, angry man who is seen to be righteously angry in a just cause, you know, putting forward his ideas and his beliefs, whereas we haven't created that space yet for women. It's a rant, it's shrill, it's hysterical. These are the words that flow.
Yeah. Now, I'm very, very reluctant to bring Mr. Abbott back into the frame, but I'm so curious to know partly what you thought his reaction was, and whether he's ever spoken to you about it.
No, he's never spoken to me about it.
That's a shame.
Yeah, I got asked some of these questions when I was in Australia, and I joked that former Australian Prime Ministers don't sort of all go and hang out in the one cubby house. You know, we're not spending our days together, you know, with jam sandwiches, sitting in a cubby house.
Oh, I remember your misogyny speech, Julia, says Tony.
Those were the days, weren't they? We don't do that. So I think this is true, I've literally only seen Tony Abbott once in the years since I left politics. So obviously I was in politics for longer post the misogyny speech. I used to see him a lot. But I've only seen him once, which was immediately after I left politics. So in 2013, I said I wouldn't recontest the election. And I literally lived my life like a fugitive, because I didn't want the Australian media to capture me anywhere while the election campaign was going on, because they would have changed it into a thing. But I did sneak up to Canberra to have a thank you lunch with the public service heads that had served the government so well, so the equivalent of the permanent secretaries here. And I was in the flight lounge, the Qantas flight lounge, and the Qantas woman, you know, she was sort of there and not there, and a bit anxious and a bit flustered. And then she came over and said, "Oh, we're really not supposed to say for security reasons, but Mr. Abbott's about to join the lounge." And it was kind of early in the morning, so I've got like a cup of coffee and some fruit or something like that. And he enters the lounge, and literally, you know, all of these business people and frequent travellers and all the rest of it, you could have heard a pin drop. And everyone was like halfway to their mouth with a cup of tea, just about to bite that piece of toast. But they were, you know, frozen into immobility because they didn't know what was going to happen next. And I thought, I can't just let this go on. So he hadn't seen me, but I walked up to him and said, Tony, how are you? And he was a bit startled, and then realised that it had caused this sort of frisson in the lounge, and I was trying to diffuse it, and he, you know, sort of said something about he was fine, and, you know, he wished me well in my future life. And then everybody, because we hadn't sort of boxed on, everybody was much more comfortable and got back to their tea and toast.
Because looking at it, you obviously, and I confess this, one does try to wonder what the narrative was from his side, and you see him collapse. You seem to see him go from sort of owning the chair, you know, to looking like a schoolboy who wishes that he could run off. And I thought, you know, she's done it. She's actually punctured that, only no doubt for a minute, but punctured that sense of entitlement.
Yeah, he has subsequently said Susan Ley, who spoke on the video, is currently the deputy leader of the opposition, and he's taken a comparable line to her, which is he thought in the circumstances of the day it was a grossly unfair speech, so unfair about him, but he's come to understand that it's, you know, means something for women who are still navigating a gendered world, so he's tried to straddle that line.
Well, you've come out ahead then, I think, if that's... You know. I wonder when it was that you realised that it was going to be more than just a good speech. You know, you're very busy, you've done it, you've put your all in, you've got lots to do the rest of the day. You probably don't pay very much attention to social media reaction. When do you know that you've done something that is special?
Yeah, I knew fairly soon, but I certainly didn't feel it immediately. So I sat down from the speech, and as you've pointed out with the body language, you know, you are relatively close to the opposition. You can read the body language, and the body language did change dramatically from very animated to very sort of, you know, inward looking and back. And so I knew it was a powerful speech, but I'd given, you know, I would hope I would be able to say for myself, I'd given other powerful speeches in the Parliament. So I knew it felt like that, but I didn't think it felt, you know, completely different to any of the other sort of bigger speeches I'd given in the Parliament. Wayne Swan, who you see sitting behind me, the Deputy Prime Minister, actually picked it much, much earlier than me and was referring to it as the Je accuse speech. And I've joked, Wayne's not the kind of person to wander around breaking into French for no reason. So that gave me a sense that there was something going on here. Catherine Murphy actually talks about watching it from the press gallery and watching Wayne Swan's face, and she still can't tell whether the emotion on his face was anxiety or admiration or flickers of both. I suspect flickers of both. So I didn't feel it then. By the time I walked back to my office after the debate had ended, you know, already calls were coming in and emails were coming in, so I knew it was having a life in the world outside. But it was really in the days afterwards when it started to get so picked up by global media. And then shortly after, I went for an official visit to India as Prime Minister, and an Indian policewoman said to me, "Great speech." And you know, that for me was really the transition moment from thinking this has been a media frisson, and I've seen many media frissons come and go across my political career, and as I observe them coming and going now in politics. It's gone from being a media frisson to actually having some meaning in the community.
Yeah. And I mean, it's very hard to pin down its effects. I mean, you can see the effects on the kids, and you can see them doing it on TikTok. You can see this kind of sense of having a brand logo, you know, look in the mirror, mate, you know. Do you think it's done more than that?
I think, I mean, it's in some ways I'm not the best person to tell, but I think it was an early forerunner of the wave of social media feminist campaigning, which we're now far more used to, but we're not back then. Yeah. I mean, because social media is now so ubiquitous in our world, I mean, Elon Musk and everything else, in 2012, I mean, social media was actually still a pretty new thing, and it was certainly a pretty new thing to the rhythm of politics, and it would not have been true to say that most people were getting their political information from social media. I mean, all of that has very much multiplied since. So I think it was an early wave of feminism, social media, and people drawing from that into their own lives. And then the far, far more profound wave was the Me Too movement, where social media finally gave women a vehicle across the world to share experiences that they'd been too ashamed of, found too personal, too distressing, often to recount even to their closest family and friends. And then they had a way of sharing them, often with anonymity, if that was the protection they needed to come out and tell their stories. And I think we've built on that since, and now it's such a mode of engagement for these young women. And I did have the opportunity in the book to interview 3 fantastic young women, and really they talk about that, and it's a version of feminism now which has shed, I think, a lot of the strictures we felt about being, you know, prepared to state our case, but always wanting to be taken seriously, conducting ourselves politely, all of those things. I think this newer generation of feminism is much more assertive, much more prepared to sort of call bullshit when they see bullshit, and really press back on it, and not that worried that people are then going to say, you know, angry girl, nasty girl, any of those things. They're sort of over that critique, and they're not that worried about it.
And their reactions are tremendous. I mean, 2 of them, I think, say, I didn't know what misogyny was. I had to go and look it up, right? And then it all falls into place. The speech or not the speech, if I were to put a very simple question, which is, are we in a better place now than we were 10 years ago for women, you know, women who want to make a due contribution, who want to be heard? What do you reckon?
I think this imagery of history not being linear and sort of, you know, a few steps forward, a shimmy to the side, a half step back, and then, you know, some more steps forward. I think that imagery is right, and I think we've gone forward on some things, but a little bit backwards on others. Of the things I certainly think we've gone forward on, the sophistication of the conversation we're having now about gender is night and day compared with when I was Prime Minister. I mean, the most fashionable critique of my Prime Ministership, even at the end of it, so even after all of this had happened, was that gender didn't play any role in my Prime Ministership. I mean, Australian commentators were routinely writing that. And that's why in my last speech as Prime Minister, I sort of put a spotlight on that by saying gender doesn't explain everything about my Prime Ministership. It doesn't explain nothing. There are shades of grey to work through. Of course, shades of grey then came to mean a whole series of other things in the years since, but who knew at the time? So, you know, I think we're having a much more sophisticated conversation. I think that much more sophisticated conversation is evidenced and full of research, and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is playing its part in that. Books like Not Now, Not Ever are playing their part in that. It's a far richer, deeper conversation. And so I think because of that, many organisations are doing very impactful things to try and drive change. If a woman is the subject of really misogynistic critiques now in the public square, people flood into it and call it out for what it is. But I think there's some things we could be doing a lot better. You know, organisations of goodwill are trying to do things for gender equality, but the evidence tells us many of the things they're trying to do actually won't drive things at a quick rate of change. So we've got to be more sophisticated using the kind of evidence that the Global Institute generates. And then the other side of people flooding the public square to protect women is the sort of seamy underside of social media, with so much anonymity, with incels, you know, with misogyny moving off social media into the real world. And, you know, there are many women now, just not just women politicians, but many women who become publicly recognisable, who deliberately downplay or curtail their careers because of the vile nature of social media, and because it comes with things like, you know, a rape threat associated with a photo of their front door. So the person sending the message is basically saying, you know, I could get you if I wanted to, or I could get your children if I wanted to. You know, we've seen what's just happened with Nancy Pelosi's husband. I mean, these things are real. And so that, I think, is a truly worrying trend.
Yeah. I mean, I keep bringing into this conversation people of whom I disapprove. I've done Thatcher, Abbott, and I'm now going to bring in Liz Truss. Because in some kind of way, she was, in terms of media reporting, she was treated, and people used to go on about her terrible voice. I mean, okay, she was only with us 44 days, so they didn't have time to develop it. But, you know, I think, you know, it is quite hard for me. I mean, you're probably much more generous, Julia, but I find it quite hard to say that this kind of sexism and misogyny hits people who are not on my side as well as hitting people on my side. And she was in some ways, I mean, there were a lot of other problems. It wasn't, don't think that gender was her only problem. But it was, I thought, an uncomfortable interlude.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, when I've spoken to media organisations, and some of them have asked me to speak to them about gender, you know, I've always said to reporters, well, I've famously in Australia said to reporters, don't write crap, how hard can it be? Which they didn't like all that much, because apparently it is quite hard to not write crap. But I've always said to them, you know, always do just, you know, the other side. I mean, if you're writing about Liz Truss, do a global sort of search and replace and just put in, you know, Bill Baxter, and then just read it again and ask yourself, if the Prime Minister's name was Bill Baxter, would I still have written it like that? You know, would I still have referred to what Bill Baxter was wearing? Would I've put that same critique around his voice, etc. And I think it's a good test. And I think, you know, if we try and do that test with the Liz Truss Prime Ministership, there is no doubt any Prime Minister who delivered an economic plan like that, which caused such instability in global markets, plunging pound, you know, Bank of England, bond markets, all the rest of it, loses their Chancellor very quickly. I think, you know, they would have been in profound political troubles, no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that some of the things along the way weren't gendered. And I think you've picked out some of them. One that I'm still thinking about, but when she did need to put Jeremy Hunt in as Chancellor under acute political pressure, you know, all of the reporting then was Jeremy Hunt is basically now the Prime Minister. She's become chair of the board and he's now the CEO. And you're like, well, would they have really written quite like that if it was two men? And is, in fact, that analogy a very good analogy, given, you know, boards get rid of CEOs and that kind of stuff? I think there was a bit of gender in that too.
Yeah. I'm going to hand over to you with one last quick question, which is, if somebody came up to you, female, and said, I'm really wondering about whether I should go into politics, how would you persuade them to do it?
I would absolutely persuade them to do it because, and you know, in conversations like this, and you know, books like Not Now, Not Ever, we're obviously focusing on the barriers that still remain. So the structural barriers, the stereotypes, the things that hold women back. And we've got to focus on those because we're never going to sweep them out the way through silence. We're only ever going to sweep them out the way if we name them, hold them up to the light, categorise them, work out what knocks them over the best. But there is a whole other side of politics, and the other side is you do get to do big things and put your values into action and to make a very big difference to the world. So one of the things that happened for me, even around the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech, is a young girl I met, Sophie, who has a profound disability. I met her when I was campaigning for the creation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, which we got to enact, and it's operating today to support Australians with disabilities. And Sophie was able to give her critique of my Prime Ministership, her critique of the misogyny speech, but also her critique of the difference the National Disability Insurance Scheme's made to her life. And if you get to do things like that, then they're the things that really endure and matter, and politics gives you that. Now,
good recommendation.
Good recommendation. Now it's my turn. Mary generously wrote a chapter for the book, which is from her perspective on misogyny. So Mary, let's start at the very beginning. What date? You can do it to the nearest year if you need to. What date did misogyny start?
With the dinosaurs, Julia, with the dinosaurs. But in terms of evidence for it, I mean, it's been here forever. But in terms of actual evidence, is the first case in Western literature, and I think I could probably do it more widely, but is in the Odyssey by Homer, composed in the 8th century BC. Second poem, second work of literature in the West, so as far back as you can go. And it's a very simple scene. Odysseus, the hero, is coming back home from the Trojan War. He's actually
taking a bit of time about it.
Taking a bit of time about it, meeting nymphs and staying 8 years, having a nice time, and shipwrecks en route. Right? Meanwhile, at home, wife Penelope is looking after the show and bringing up their son Telemachus, who is basically a wet behind the ears teenager. One day, it goes on for years, Penelope comes downstairs and finds the people in the house having a party, and the bard is singing a song about what a terrible time all the heroes of Greece are having getting back from the Trojan War. She perfectly reasonably says, do you think we could change the track, really? Perhaps you could sing something a bit more cheerful, right? Absolutely reasonable. Telemachus comes over and says, Mum, speech is man's business. Go upstairs. And this clever, savvy, middle-aged woman goes upstairs. Now, there's two things that strike me about that, apart from it's just obvious, familiar. How many times have we been told to shut up and go upstairs? Very often. First, I think, it's not just that Telemachus says that. It's the story of this poem is about how Telemachus grows up. And this is a major incident in Telemachus growing up. If you're a man, in order to grow up, you have to learn to shut women up. So shutting women up is about the maturation of the male. He's not just being nasty, he's doing what he should. Fast forward 2,500 years, and this fits, I think, very much with what you're saying about calling things out. I'd read the Odyssey for about 20 or 30 years, on and off, and I'd taught the Odyssey. And it was only really about 15, 20 years ago that I was reading this book again. And I thought, bloody hell. I'd read this and I'd not seen it. And I think when you say, look, what is really important is we need to learn, you have to learn to recognise it and to say, hang on, everybody, look at this. And for me, that that kind of Telemachus Penelope moment is important, not only because it's, you know, first surviving incident of misogyny that you can actually track in the West, it also is a constant reminder to me of how I just didn't notice. I did not notice. And, you know, and that is a small kind of metaphor for all the times that we don't notice.
Is another thing that we don't notice the sort of embedded cultural narratives about women and evil. So Helena Kennedy, for example, has written Eve was framed. We in Australia start events with a welcome to country from an Indigenous elder, and the lovely Indigenous elder who would frequently do welcomes to country in the Australian Parliament House would always say, if Adam and Eve had been Indigenous Australians, they would have killed and eaten the snake, so human history would have been entirely different. So I'll leave that with you, something to think about. But of course there's, you know, Pandora's box, you know, it's her fault for letting evils out into the world. Do you think we underestimate that? Or I'm not a classicist bootleg, so please correct me when I go wrong.
I mean, there's a whole kind of concatenation of things, which is that women in power means bad, right? And one of the ways of expressing that is to express it through, it's, you know, it's ditch the witch or the bitch, you know, any itch, you know, anything ending in itch is what women are, and it's bad. And, you know, 50 years ago, I suppose, people did look at some of these stories, feminists look at these stories of women taking power in ancient Greek mythology. And they, I think, totally understandably, but utterly wrongly, started to say, well, look, actually, what this is showing us, you know, forget Beard saying that misogyny goes back to the dinosaurs. Once upon a time, before we can ever quite see, there was a moment when women did have power. And what has happened is they've been removed from it. The more you look at all these stories of powerful women in Greek mythology or any early mythology, frankly, the more you look at them, the more you discover that women only are imagined to take power in order that the story can say they really fucked up, right? You know, they kill their husband, you know, things go, you know, terribly wrong, you know, the kind of Liz Truss narrative, I'm afraid, is frequently found in Greek myth. And so everything you see around you is confirmatory of the idea that women can't hack it. And whether it's because they lead men astray, whether it's the power of the seductress, the power of the enchanter, the power of the poisoner. You know, why are all these powerful women in the Roman Empire, like, you know, Livia in Augustus's, in Robert Graves' I, Claudius, you know, why are they said to be poisoners? Because you can never trust a woman, right? And we're so surrounded with that we don't notice it. You just, I think, don't notice it. And I think, oh God, I'm going to mention another person of whom I disapprove a bit. You know, we read the stories about what went on in Boris Johnson's Number 10 and what Carrie did, and all over again, it's Carrie chose the expensive wallpaper, Carrie was wanting this, and you could say the same for Hillary Clinton with Bill, you could say the same for Cherie Blair with Tony, that everywhere we look, we find the ill deeds, in some sense, of a woman being a fantastic explanatory device and actually letting the men off the hook.
I've had a fantastic image then of a classicist in 2,000 years' time telling this ancient story of a woman in power and a lettuce.
Yes, that's right.
It's going to make a wonderful myth, isn't it?
It is going to be absolutely perfect.
Absolutely
perfect. But I think, however, there is... I think one of the things we might sometimes do, though, is flip this on its head. I think we might flip it, because I think one of the ways to think about that kind of misogynistic culture is to say, you can't escape it. You know, you go to an art gallery, you know, and it's, you know, some woman enticing some poor old bloke into his death in a murky pool or whatever, right? You know, and you know, so, and because we're acculturated, and because we live in this culture, partly that's what we've come to expect. I think that, and it's really what I say, I suppose, in the essay in the book, I think possibly we might flip that and say, look, one of the reasons that there's all this rhetoric and discourse and image making around misogyny is because it's such a feeble ideology. You know, why do we have to tell ourselves so many stories about women being seductresses, temptresses, whatever? It's culture trying to make a lie seem true, right? And I kind of sometimes cheer myself up by saying the extraordinary noise that misogyny makes, you know, whether it's red pill communities or complete idiots on social media or whatever, the noise shows you how feeble it is. It shows you how fragile it's protecting itself. And if we could be more confident that the boys all know it's fragile, really, I think we might be able to prize it apart a bit more. I mean, okay, they've had 3,000 plus years of practice, so I don't imagine I'm going to see it. But I was talking about it at another event a few weeks ago, and you know, I think actually there are ways that we make inroads to this and show misogyny up all the time if we could just be a bit more confident about it. And I told the story about my mum, who, when I was in my teens, we used to live opposite a pub, and it was a very old-fashioned English pub, and there was a bar, and there was a big notice hanging up at the bar saying men only, because the women had to go and drink in the snug. My mum was quite a toughie, and she went and she used to drink her drink standing directly under the notice that said men only. And she got quite a bit of flack, as you can imagine. Except one day she went into the pub and the notice wasn't there anymore.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You know, now if you could just magnify that, you know, by, you know, a million mini incidents every day, we'd soon win.
So instead of microaggressions, we've got to have, you know, the...
Micro fight backs.
Micro fight backs. You're someone who's, you know, obviously in the public eye. You've done so many outwards-facing activities for a classicist. Not every classicist is routinely on TV and books and all the rest of it. And, I mean, that has brought you all sorts of critiques. I mean, famously told Too Ugly for Television, yes. I think was the...
Yes. A.A. Gill, bless him.
Yes, A.A. Gill. And, you know, you've seen more, you know, more than your... Well, I was going to say more than your fair share, but fair share is not the right terminology. Far too much negativity on social media. Do you... I mean, as a classicist, how do you look at that? Do you actually read these, you know, badly spelt tweets and say to yourself, oh, I can connect that with a view of misogyny from several thousand years ago? How do you think about that?
I do sometimes think that, because the tropes are the same. Right. You know? And, you know, you start out thinking they're going for me because of something I've said. And that's what it looks like. They're really going for you because you're saying anything. You know, it's what the aggression comes to a woman speaking, not actually to what she says very much. But I think that I sort of turned the corner with this. I mean, it's still very, you know, you pick up your phone and you find someone saying, you know, you stupid, you know, whatever, I'm going to come and rape you or whatever. And, you know, and anybody who says, I don't mind about that, is not telling you the truth. But I felt a lot better when I started to answer back. You know, because, you know, I was told at the beginning of all this, absolute rule, social media, block them, don't reply, don't give them the oxygen of publicity, just move on, block and move. And I'm sure there are people for whom that works, and I think you have to find your own way of dealing with it. You can't really give anybody advice. But I kind of thought, if I went into a pub, sorry, another pub, and I you know, came across the men in the back room, putting them in the back room now, and they were saying, gosh, she's an absolute, you know, just imagine what her whatever tastes like. You can imagine this. Would I kind of just leave? No, I'd say, excuse me, you know, you're talking about me here. You know, can you, you know, I don't think that's quite fair. And so it's taken me a jolly long time to learn this. But I now, if somebody directly attacks me, I reply. And I have only one rule, which is I don't get cross. If I think I'm getting cross, I put the phone away. I mean, but it's been really helpful. It's been helpful in two ways. One is, you know, I felt in the past, by just kind of moving on and not saying anything, it was like kind of leaving the bullies in charge of the playground, really. You know, that, so, you know, Twitter is supposed to be a place where we can all play, but as soon as anybody's nasty, they get left on the medium and I get thrown off. So that was very helpful. But also in a kind of terms of human interaction. There are some people out there who are extremely nasty, who really are hardcore misogynists, you know, no doubt about that. There's also quite a lot of people, men I think, but not only, who are a bit sad, a bit kind of desperate, a bit feeling lonely, probably had a bit too much to drink. And now, one of the ways that desperation comes out, and this is a worry, is in misogynistic chat. That's what it gets channeled into. But quite often, or often enough for it to be worthwhile, you'll say, excuse me, I didn't quite say that. And they will tweet back and say, no, I'm terribly sorry, you didn't. I was feeling a bit down. Oh. Right? I had a wonderful one from a guy who was doing something, I can't remember now what it was, and he said, God, I never thought you'd reply. Actually, I'm really keen on history. I'm a retired... I'm a retired policeman, and I've just had a heart bypass operation. This was more than we needed to know, wasn't it? And we meet every week in Glasgow. So if you're ever in Glasgow and would like to come and have a drink, and this took several tweets, as you can understand, please do. And I thought, there was a man who just nobody had noticed, you know, I'm afraid. And he was getting over his operation, and he was really keen on history. And getting back to him was a positively good thing to do.
You're a nicer woman than I am. That's for sure.
I think you were pretty nice to Tony Abbott.
Though somehow we've gone from classics into an examination of problems with the police. But anyway, attitudes in the police, that'll have to be a whole other talk on a whole other day. We're going to come now for a couple of rounds of audience questions. I think there are roving mics. So where are the mics coming from? Oh, do you want to get to the man in the back and then we'll come down here?
Thank you again for a wonderful event. I just wondered, 10 years on from the misogyny speech, and given the experiences of women in politics in the UK and someone like Julie Bishop in Australia, do you think anybody's learned anything?
Yes, I do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to answer this question, and then if you could bring the mic down, there were two people on the row here. I do. I genuinely do. And in Australia, you know, I think we can take a lot of heart from the last election, not just that the Labor Party won, which of course, you know, close to my heart, but that the Labor Party now is presenting in the federal parliament and in state parliaments with teams that are half men, half women, that the political fracture line that caused the Conservative loss was, there were more than one, but one of the very deep fracture lines was over questions of gender and women independents who were enraged both by the anti-climate change policies but also the anti-women policies getting mobilised and then taking some of the safest seats off the Conservatives. I think that's still going to work its way through how the Conservative Party thinks about its future and potentially rebuilds. So, you know, I do genuinely think, you know, change is often painfully won, but it is happening. It is happening. So we'll take the two questions here. Yes, please.
Hi, Julia. Thanks so much. Elizabeth Ames. I'm the chair of the Menzies Australia Institute at King's, and it's great to have you. My favourite question that you ask on your podcast is, what would you do for women if you were the ruler of the world for a day? And so I'd like to ask you that question.
I asked Mary that, and I think she said invent a better pair of tights. That might have to be one. What she really should have said is there's, of course, any number of stories across the ages where granting people wishes goes horribly wrong.
Yes.
I guess I'd do the biggest wish possible. I'd wish to end all forms of discrimination, including gender discrimination, and see what kind of world we could be without it all. That would be a world to live in, wouldn't it? I think I'd need to get a very special bottle with a very special genie in order to have that wish come true. I know Idris Elba's doing a turn as a genie at the moment, but might even be beyond him. Yes.
Thank you, Julie. When you made that speech, whether you reflected on it at the time or since, there are 1.5 billion women that absolutely would have connected with that, because as you recall, you were chair of the Commonwealth at that time. You know, you had just hosted a very successful, fairly successful Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Perth, and I remember you highlighting the Commonwealth Charter was one of the things you were proudest about, coming out of your time as chair for the first time, that link between girls in school and women in work. So my question is, you know, that although many people didn't pick up on it, certainly people in the Commonwealth definitely looked at you at that moment and saying, this is someone who is the chair. We've not had many women chairs of the Commonwealth who made that speech. So my question is around, if you look at the places for intervention in Commonwealth spaces to drive change in this area, which of these three would you really put at the top of your list? Commonwealth parliamentarians, Commonwealth private sector. Of course, there was the Male Champions of Change initiative that you obviously drove when you were Prime Minister, but also the education system, the education ecosystem. I mean, I know they're all important, but which would you put right at the top of the list?
Look, because this is an ecosystem, I'm not sure that we can put one at the top of the list. What we can certainly say is, you know, girls' education is the enabling foundation stone of everything else. And I chaired the Global Partnership for Education for a number of years. In countries where we're still trying to win that fight, unless we win that fight, then we can't imagine a future of gender equality. And in some places in the world, that's definitely going backwards. Think Afghanistan, and the current economic troubles are going to mean that there, I think, is tragically less investment in girls' education and education generally in developing countries and emerging economies than there was in the run-up to the pandemic. But it's the foundation stone, but it's not the complete answer, because if equalising education chances for girls and boys was the answer, then we would, here and in many other countries in the world, Australia, be living in gender equal societies. And so that doesn't mean there aren't any education inequalities. Obviously there's things about STEM and the like, but generally women tend to do better on education now than boys and young men. So, you know, you need to do more, and you need both the private sector and the government to lean into that. They've got different powers, different abilities, but they're both great change makers if they choose to be. I think we've got time for, we'll take a couple more questions, then we are going to have to go. Well, here, please, and then what we might try and do is sweep up these three, and then I think we're going to have to call it a night. So 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, a fabulous event. Anne-Marie Rafferty, Professor of Health and Nursing Policy here at King's. So I was actually in Australia, Julia, when you made your speech and it was being televised. We were watching the news and everyone was just, you know, transfixed. But what I recalled first and foremost was it just was a brilliant piece of rhetoric. And it was reminding me as well of your interview here and conversation with Theresa May and thinking about political culture, and Mary's also a great scholar of rhetoric and mentioned that word as well. And my question really is, we know that many of our prime ministers, and it's so brilliantly elucidated in Simon Cooper's book, Chums, are actually trained in the forcing grounds of Oxford and Cambridge debating societies. And I actually, apparently, rumour has it that, Mary, you're one of the few people who's really taught Boris Johnson in a debate on classics.
I did. It's my finest hour.
Absolutely. And he retreated like a wounded dog on his own because he can't stand being beaten. The question is, you know, do we beat these guys at their own game? Do we send, you know, people to be trained in rhetoric to the unions? Is that where we need to focus our investment, our attention? Or do you concur with Audre Lorde that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools?
I'm going to ask Mary to contribute on this too. That's a very deep question, and one we think about a lot at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, in the sense that the very word leadership invites people to think about, you know, pyramids of power with a very few people at the top. But we're trying to interrogate what does leadership mean at the same time. And, you know, I'm an optimist but a realist. The optimist in me says we can find other ways of resolving conflicts and issues and public policy than the, you know, aggressive debating styles that are institutionalised in our parliaments and in so much of the rest of our culture. We can do that, and we should be thinking about how to do that. And heavens knows democracies need new energy and new enthusiasm, and these older systems are not capturing contemporary hearts and minds. But we can't just, you know, wait for that to happen. In the meantime, we've got to be engaging in the power structures as we find them, and making sure that people who believe in gender equality and ending discrimination more generally are in those power structures and using those levers for change.
I think in part it's because I knew what those guys got taught to do that I felt confident to do something different. You know, it was knowing where they came from that enabled me to say, well, I'm not bloody well going to do that. And it was when I thought I could talk how I wanted to talk, without saying, but sir, you know, in their kind of way, that I felt liberated to actually make contribution. But I think you need to know the enemy as well. Otherwise they'll walk all over you.
So we'll take those last two questions. And perhaps if you can ask your question and hand the mic on, and we'll take both at once.
Great, thank you very much. Very enjoyable evening. I'd like to add my thanks for having the opportunity to listen to you both. As a public servant, over the years, I've enjoyed the benefits of mansplaining by the men around me, as it were. On top of that, I very much look back and see the squiggly line we've all followed, i.e. I've been able to get a mortgage, whereas my mother wouldn't have been able to, etc. However, I'm worrying as I look around the world now and see how misogyny is evolving. In particular, the fact that we can't say what a woman is, with assurance anymore. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on how misogyny is evolving to undermine women by the very fact that we can no longer say what a woman is without being questioned.
Can you just pass the mic back, and we're just going to grab the other question too. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to say I was also 13 when you gave that speech, and it was very much a big part of my life, and I was lucky enough that my mum is also a very strong woman who's into politics, so it's very much been reinforced as a part of my upbringing, I would say, and so it's just amazing to be here tonight. But as a young woman entering the workforce recently and having to navigate asking for salary and things like that, I've sort of experienced imposter syndrome for the first time in my life, which I know is a very common thing for women in the workforce. And I'm wondering for you, as the first female Prime Minister, if all that noise about all that misogyny ever kind of infiltrated you, and did you ever have those moments of having to tackle imposter syndrome and acknowledge, has it ever been an issue for you? Because I know for myself, I still identify as like a very strong woman, but I know those thoughts are kind of because of a force outside of myself. And I'm just wondering if you've ever had that experience, and if you have any, or any women in politics who've been through a similar thing.
Yeah, look, I've certainly had that experience, and one of the things that I've reflected on since, and at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, one of the academics we've done some work with is a man called Thomas Chimaro Premusic, who's an organisational psychologist, and literally wrote a book called, Why Do We Keep Promoting Incompetent Men and What Can We Do About It? In that, through the lens, he didn't start out to write a book about gender. He started out to write a book about what are the characteristics of leadership which are truly correlated with success, as opposed to the ones we think are. And what he ended up working out was we're kind of suckers for confidence, charisma, for swagger, for an absence of self-doubt. But actually, when you look at who succeeds and who fails, these are not characteristics that are associated with success. And so it's made me look back and my own self-doubts and imposter syndrome along the way, and reimagine that as, what kind of megalomaniac really steps into a job like Prime Minister or President of the United States or whatever, going, I've got this, exactly. I've got this.
That's right.
Climate change, snap. Fixing the Ukraine conflict, no problems. I'll have that done by breakfast.
Right.
What kind of idiot sort of sees themselves like that? If you're not kind of plagued with, oh my heavens, this is a complex, fragmented world. These are really big challenges. Got to think about them very deeply. Got to reach out for others. Got to get the best of their intelligence and views. Got to mobilise a formidable team. If they aren't the thoughts in your head, then that's a problem. So I actually think the fact you sometimes second guess yourself, it's a strength, not a weakness, and feel that about it. On the earlier question, then I'll go to Mary for some concluding comments. On the earlier question, I certainly think that there's a lot of media, a lot of conservative profiting at the moment around divisions they think can be stoked on social media. And I always think, I've forgotten the person, but there's someone who coined the great phrase, never be a profiteer in the culture wars. And I think it's a really good phrase, because too many people, I think, are engaging to try and keep the divisions going, rather than think their way through to the maximum amount of inclusion. And I genuinely do think we can do that if we try to do that. And that's certainly our aim at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. But Mary, what would you like to say in response to the questions? Any concluding comments?
I want to say how much I agree with you about imposter syndrome. And it's taken me years to see that I wish actually there were some people who had more of it. You know? Well, you know, I don't think any of my friends are entirely free of imposter syndrome, and we don't much like people who don't have it.
Absolutely. Well, with those words, please go out and enjoy the reception first, then perhaps go out into the world and find someone who needs a bit more imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Explain to them why they do. And in the meantime, perhaps I could ask you to thank the remarkable Mary Beard.
Oh, and great book, by the way.
Thank you for joining us here tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you. And we just go this way.